Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now we're living through what I think is the largest ever behavioural experiment, at least one that we've experienced in our own lifetimes. We're all being asked to do different things and behave in very different ways than we normally do. And I thought that was interesting from a human risk perspective. After all, governments are in simple terms managing human risk. And so I wanted to get someone onto the podcast that could help us understand how governments are doing it, reflect on which techniques are working well, look at what's not working so well, and understand how this goes forward. And Benjamin van Rooij, who's from the University of Amsterdam, is a professor that specialises in the topic of how laws influence human behaviour. And he, along with some colleagues, has been doing some research in various jurisdictions looking at people's behaviour under the various government requirements that COVID has imposed. So I thought he would be the ideal person to have a conversation with. And in our discussion, we explore the research that he's undertaking at the moment, the research that he wants to undertake in the future, and some key findings from what he's discovered so far. UK listeners may be particularly interested in his views on Dominic Cummings. That's the advisor to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has in recent days been hitting the headlines for, let's just say it, not being entirely compliant with the rules that he himself set. So you can hear that and a whole host more relevant things on this podcast. It was a really fun episode to record, some fascinating live insights, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Benjamin van Rooij. Benjamin, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to be discussing because I think it's very timely. But before we get into that, could you just give my listeners an idea of your area of specialism, and what attracted you to it?
Yes. So I study how legal rules shape human and organizational behavior. So I'm interested in everything from, let's say, the worst of the worst, direct corruption, crime, to more mundane things like are people washing hands when organizations tell them to do so. Got interested in this when early 2000s I studied environmental law in China and tried to understand how local factories were breaking rules, how they were complying with rules, and what all of that meant for what I'd learned as a lawyer. And mostly I found everything I learned as a lawyer wasn't really how it worked out in practice. So ever since I've been to what some people consider the dark side, which is trying to understand what I consider pretty normal human behavior.
And look, let's dive straight in, because you've recently been doing some really interesting work looking at what I loosely term as the world's largest ever behavioral experiment, which is what we're going through at the moment under COVID-19. And what's the sort of thinking there? What are you trying to establish in the work that you're doing?
So we started this in March, and it all started with my frustration not getting an op-ed out. So I wrote an op-ed, which later got placed, called How to Lock Down an Open Society. And I tried to bring out some of the key insights from behavioral science, social science, to this massive compliance in the time of Corona. So even mid-March, when the lockdown started in most of the Western world, it immediately seemed to me, okay, what we're asking people to do is something fundamentally different than they normally do, at great cost, with very limited capacity for actual enforcement. So indeed, it's a massive experiment. And I found, okay, I can write about this from science and from existing theories, but this is unprecedented. What's happening here, I don't think we can use existing science to kind of say, okay, we know exactly what will happen. This was different. So we need to get data. So together with my research team at the University of Amsterdam, as well as with Adam Fine, a criminologist and psychologist from Arizona State University, and Yuval Feldman, who's been on the show before, from Bar-Ilan, we developed this survey, which we administered in the US, UK, the Netherlands, Israel. We're actually right now gearing up to do it in China and Hong Kong. And we did so early April. In hindsight, early April is a very unique time in the US, UK, and the Netherlands. This was the time we were all 2 weeks into lockdown, and everybody was sort of doing their thing as they should. It was also a sweet spot in the US where sort of everybody rallied around the president, and the president rallied around the scientists for 1 or 2 weeks. So it was a very special time that we now have historical data on this kind of early stages lockdown compliance. Anyway, that's how it all started.
And so what you're really trying to do is to say, look, how are people behaving in this very unusual environment, and what methods are being used, either successfully or unsuccessfully, to influence that? Is that sort of the broad scope?
Yes, that's the broad scope. That's sort of it. Yeah.
And obviously there are going to be differences between countries, which we can come on to. But sort of, I mean, what's your sort of broad findings in terms of how this is reacted? Because the way you depicted it was at the start, and to the extent I can remember when that was. It did feel like a time where everybody was on board.
Yes.
And it sort of seemed like a collective effort. And almost it was bringing out the best in everybody because governments were saying things and people were just sort of doing it.
Yes.
And obviously over time we've seen, and there's exceptions to that,
sure.
but roughly.
Sure.
And then we've seen a change over that. So what was the sort of initial pieces that you were finding at that time, and then how has that changed?
So first of all, I think that's the first lesson for anybody that is interested in compliance or rules and behavior. We should first define what we looked at and what we didn't look at. So the first design I made of the survey was much broader. It had hand washing. It had people, for instance, also not going on shopping sprees and all these other things that were asked of people, handshaking. But we ended up throwing all of that out because a good social science study, you actually design it in a way that you have these outcome variables, dependent variables, and you have these independent variables, so things that can be of influence. So for us, the behaviors we looked at, the outcome variables, there were 3 kinds. First of all, there was not meeting people outside of your own household. So you could perfectly be in compliance with a lockdown. Oh, that's my daughter. It's a typical lockdown thing. So you could be perfectly in compliance with a lockdown, but still have friends come over to your house. So you don't go outside yourself. So that's the first thing we looked at. Are you still meeting friends? Are they still coming to your house? Second thing is, are you keeping a safe distance from others? So people are allowed to go out for shopping, for instance, still under the rules, but are they then keeping a safe distance, which was differently defined in different jurisdictions, but still they all three we studied initially had the same rules, or 4 Israel as well. And the third one was, are you staying home except for activities where you're allowed to go out? So that's what we looked at. We found, first of all, that in all 4 countries, but I'm not going to talk too much about Israel because the paper isn't finished yet, so I'm focusing on the US, UK, and the Netherlands. In all 3 countries, we saw that compliance was high on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being you always, every time of the day, are in compliance. Everybody scored between 6 and 7. So on average. So there were some that were lower, but on average it was very high. Second, I think the findings are most consistent in what we didn't see. We didn't see that deterrence, which we measured as how high are the chances that you're going to get caught, so the certainty of punishment, or how much influence will the eventual punishment be if you do get punished. We didn't see that deterrence had an effect. So it was not significantly related to their compliance behavior. It didn't predict the compliance behavior. That's a big finding. I think if you're asking what is a takeaway, it's, well, we can't expect simply to change behavior by just focusing on stronger punishment and not even on more policing. I'm not saying that means that you can take away the punishment. That would be a counterfactual type of question. We would have to imagine a society where there would be 0 punishment. I'm pretty sure that once that happens, you'd have a completely different survey. I'm pretty sure if you take away the punishment, it would change behavior radically. But it does mean that you can't see that just having stronger punishment in of itself will lead to desired behavioral change. So that was a major, major finding that we see consistent across these 3 countries. Second thing is that the cost of compliance, at least in early April, didn't matter, which to me was more surprising. The first wasn't that surprising. I can talk more about that. The second, you think if you are losing a lot of income because of these measures, if you're losing your job because of it, if it's just very expensive for you, then at some point you'll say, look, I'm just gonna go out on the street or make money or do other things. But they didn't. That didn't make a difference. So those were the two big things I would say that all these three cases had in common. Then if we look at what did play a role, there's a couple of variables that stand out. And if I just summarize them more broadly, there's two things that matter. One is people's intrinsic motivation. To what extent do they think morally, okay, these are rules we have to obey, these specific types of rules? That was important in almost all of the instances. Second, to what extent do they see others obeying the rules? That played a role in the US. So the more you saw other people complying, the more you complied yourself. So that's also a sort of intrinsic motivation. It comes from the people around you. We also saw, to a certain extent, that the legitimacy of the rules mattered. So in some of the cases we studied, for instance, we saw this in England, we see that if you think you have a general duty to obey the law, you generally have to obey rules, then you're going to be more compliant. So that sort of formed the intrinsic motivation part. Then the second big part was very practical. I think that's really underestimated to a certain extent, even though it's so obvious. The more you were able to comply with these rules, for instance, if you're able to work from your home, very practical. If you're able to keep a safe distance from others in your everyday life, the more you would comply. And there's also the flip side to that, the opportunity to violate. The more you could still go to work even though you weren't allowed. The more you could get within 1.5 meters from other people in the Netherlands, the rule, or within 6 feet in the US, the more you would do so. And these two, I think, are really, really vital. I think, especially if we fast forward to now that we're opening up, I kind of compare what happened early April with a crash diet. So if you go to January, it's just been Christmas, you're like, okay, I got fat, I wanna lose my weight. How do you lose weight? You just don't buy a whole lot of stuff. All right? You make it impossible for yourself to get fat for a while. So for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you don't get those cookies, you don't get the ice creams. But then you want to go back to a normal life. Your friends ask you over for dinner, and you kind of have to make choices again. And that seems how it is now. So in April, we were on the crash diet. The government, with all the lockdown, made it nearly impossible. We couldn't go to the bar, we couldn't go to the restaurant, we couldn't even go to the beach because the parking was closed. So largely, we didn't have much choice in whether we would comply or not. Now that you put all that open again, you're actually asking a lot more of people in terms of behavior. You're asking people to make choices, whereas at the beginning they didn't. So I think that variable is very, very important. And what seems to be happening now, and I know this close in the Netherlands, is that from the government shutting down, we've now moved to sort of the government asking the markets, so restaurants, shops, businesses, to kind of make these more lower level types of choice architectures. So we've all seen it in supermarkets. There's only one way to walk, or there's fewer shopping baskets, so not a lot of people can go in. But the more we open up and the more you're asking individual responsibility of people, the harder it will be. Finally, as a third type of variable that I think is really important, also underestimated, there was the impulsivity, impulse control. We saw in the US, as well as in the Netherlands, we saw that the less people were able to control their own impulses, which is just a characteristic of people, the more they would violate the rules. And that makes sense as well. If it's hard for you to kind of control yourself, you're not going to stay away from friends if you feel that at some point. So that sort of is in line with what I just said earlier about this early lockdown, where even if you had low impulse control, you try and go out with friends for a beer, people are gonna notice. And it's very hard to do because there's not many places you can go. If you're trying to go to work, even though your work is closed, you can't do that. You're trying to go into public transport, that's different now. So I think that's sort of the story.
That's fascinating. So many things I want to unpick there. But I mean, one question I've got is around the sort of, we talk about intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. I mean, clearly underpinning all of this, there are the risks associated with the virus.
Yep.
So you might not buy that your government's approach is right. Maybe you think
Yep.
you have there's certain entitlements that you have. How much does that virus and your perception of the risks it poses to you play into that thinking, do you think?
So we had 3 questions on that in the survey. We had a question about your own health, question about health of friends and family, and a question about general health. In the US, they didn't play a role early April, which was surprising to us. And fear of health in the US wasn't lower than it was in other countries. It was comparable. But it didn't play a role. So people with higher fear complied as varied as people with lower fear. It did play a role in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, we see higher fear of health is higher compliance, which you would expect. Then in the UK, we saw it didn't play a role for meeting people and safe distance, but it played a very weird role for lockdown, which I don't understand. People with a higher fear of disease are less likely to comply with lockdown measures. And that's sort of the problem with doing this type of research. Sometimes you have these wow findings, and there's no way you understand them. For me, this is one of those things, we report it, maybe other people later can figure it out. I've not been able to come up with any reason for this. We did also ask about negative emotions. This is based on the idea that if you feel very negative because of a certain situation, you might cope with the situation by breaking rules more often. There's a whole criminology about this. And in England, we did see that people with negative emotions about being in the coronavirus situation were more likely to violate lockdown measures. So maybe the fear of disease made them feel so bad they wanted to go out, which is sort of irrational. It may be something where you feel already so locked in. So that's the only sort of explanation I could find in our data there.
And I can sort of see the point of kind of maybe moral licensing, also where you kind of go, I've been really well behaved, but I want to have a sense of breaking the rules somewhere.
Yes.
And is there a sense of sort of I'll do that in a low risk way, or is it less control than that?
So unfortunately, our questionnaire already had 20 minutes of questions. If you have more than 20 minutes, you're going to get garbage. So we didn't have moral licensing, or as criminologists call it, neutralization. In the questionnaire. I do think it's an interesting one. I don't think, based on what we found in the survey, it probably would have played out much. But again, we also didn't have any questions about shame or guilt. But to give you an indication, social norms only played a role in the US. So what you think others are doing. So I'm not sure it would have done much. I think right now, this is very important. This is very, very important. I mean, what you call moral licensing, criminologists call the technique of the ledger. So I've already done so many good things, I can do a bad thing right now. I think you get to that. That's also why I now compare it with a diet. It works the same in a diet. I have kept on a strict diet for a month. Now I can let loose. And you start a little, then you get the slippery slope. Well, I've already had one cookie. I can have more cookies. I think that's happening anecdotally. I see that also happening around here. People at first would really not gather. And now you see more of that. And then, well, I think there's a lot of rule bending. Sort of, for instance, how do you define your own household? So at the start, you define it as that little core unit you're with. At some point, you might say, well, my neighbors, if I redefine my idea of a household, I can meet my neighbors at less than 1.5 meters distance. My elderly parents, well, they're not seeing anybody else. So in that sense, you might get ever larger circles. And these circles might at some point start to overlap. At some point, it could restart the spread of the disease. So there is a danger there, I think, of slippage once people start to redefine what the rules mean. And that I think is also happening. I mean, the early rules, early April, were much clearer than they are now.
Right, and there's a sense of sort of imposing a lockdown is relatively easy because it's just a sort of blanket piece, and you come up with various proxy. There's a codification of something that is not really valid in the sense that, you know, the distance piece. It's not like the virus suddenly travels for a meter and then falls down to the ground, and therefore the risk is eliminated. If you're just outside the meter or whatever the distance is, you're okay, and if you're just inside it, you're in grave danger.
Yes,
and all of these things are codifications of very complex dynamics as a manner of getting people to comply. And so imposing that, I guess, is relatively straightforward because you can just say to people, here's the moment you try and unpick that, it gets a bit harder.
Well, I think, and that's a piece we also didn't study. It's sort of from the motivational science. So how are you going to get people to be motivated to do something for a long period of time? The first time we did it, they kind of used techniques that I think are well established in science. First was it's sort of the foot in the door technique. So you say, all right, let's just do this now, for now. They told us at the beginning it's going to be 9 weeks or 10 weeks, and then we're still not done. I don't think we would have complied as well. So what they did in the beginning was sort of, it felt like, okay, we're going to be 1, maybe 2 weeks in. So that's how they got us in. Once we were in, it felt much weirder to go out. So I think that's an important thing. Second is, this was the first time around. How well will they be able to do this the second time around? Let's say we get a second wave, we need to go back inside again. Or any of the rules that they've loosened if they want to tighten them again. I think it's going to be increasingly hard, not just from a compliance perspective, but also from a political perspective. And of course, by now we know the economic and social damage, which is massive. So I have been wondering a lot about this, which is more the wisdom of the approach. All right, let's say we have the following scenario. And I'm not saying I hope we do. I hope we don't. Let's say in 3 months, we know that hopes for vaccine are not going to be as easy as we think. Neither is a cure. For instance, because the disease mutates more than we think, or because it's very resistant to traditional vaccine approaches. Second, we see that because we loosened the restrictions, there's a second wave and it's bad. Let's add one element to it just to make it easier to think. The disease has mutated and it's become a little bit worse. It's causing more autoimmune responses with younger people. So younger people start dying. Can we then do the same thing as we do now? Sort of ask people to stay inside where we can't really show them how it's going to stop the disease. I think that's an interesting thing, is to think about what if we'd had a full lockdown? What if we'd really stopped and killed the disease from the start? So anyway, that's not really only a compliance question, it's also an epidemiological and I think also a very big logistical question. But because we've done this first lockdown, and because people were very good in compliance, if we can't show them a clear goal coming out of a new lockdown, and that's what I mean with a full lockdown, if you can show them the goal, if you do this for 1 month fully, you come out, everything's open again. I think that's easier. It's much harder to get people to go into a second lockdown with the same promises, which is probably going to be 8 or 9 weeks, and then the curve is flattened again, and you can sort of go out again, but the economy can't really restart because in Holland we call it the 1.5 meter society. Which, in the 1.5 meter society, there's so much that doesn't work economically speaking. So, for instance, at my university, we estimate that we can get back 20% of teaching back in the buildings. 20%. And that's just university. The amount of work going into it to try and sort of get things back at 20%. So I'm very worried about behavioral change later down the line. I think it's going to be harder and harder and harder. And at some point, people are just I think there are going to be more people resisting the policies. But anyway, that's speculation. That's not the study.
Right. That's just fascinating. It lends credence to your dieting analogy, I think, because there you go. If I'm dieting loads and I'm not seeing the weight falling off me, then what the hell am I doing? I might as well enjoy myself. And yes. I think that's a lovely way of looking at the thing.
Well, and the biggest danger is if you have a yo-yo effect, as we call it in Dutch. So you diet, Your body adapts to the diet. It gets more hungry. Every time it takes food in, it'll ask for more for a very long time, for years. So actually dieting can make you fat. That metaphor doesn't fully apply to this situation, but the kind of question is, if you put people through a massive achievement like we've all did, I mean, let's just call it that. It's been a massive achievement that everybody has complied so well. If you then let them out and let them go back again, can we truly expect them to do this again? And if they do, what will be the consequences then on their own behavior, on things like abuse, on work productivity and other things? So I think there's a major challenge here that I don't hear enough people thinking about, okay, what is the second wave like? I mean, we haven't cured a thing right now. We've only spread it out for a bit.
Right, so we've just bought some time. And it's interesting the way you're talking about it, because you're almost saying, and maybe you are saying this, the way that we dealt with the early stages will have an implication for how we can deal with it. So what is feasible for us to do in the secondary space? Not so much from a legal, can we introduce this, but from a how will people react to it?
Yes.
And so with that in mind, I'm intrigued by your comments around deterrence and punishment, because the traditional logic to get people to do stuff, let's get sort of North Korean on them, right? Yes. We'll police the hell out of it, and there'll be severe punishment for not doing it. And as you say, what's interesting about this is there's a range of things you can absolutely police because you can watch what people do in the street. Yep. You cannot see what they're doing behind the scenes. Yep. And so there's this flexibility. So that wasn't really used, and yet we see examples of governments try sort of, to a certain extent, attempting to use it. Yep. I mean, I'm intrigued as to sort of thinking about one the dynamics of sort of what your thoughts are on that. And you mentioned that it was obvious to you around the impact that would have in terms of people's thinking. But secondly, how does that play later on? Because presumably you can't bring these dynamics to bear if you haven't already deployed them and people have a different perspective on what compliance means. So
there's so many ways to look at the question of punishment. So let's zoom back. Let's take one step back. I mean, first of all, why do we punish? If we punish to change behavior, which is the core goal here, then we have to look at, okay, what can we expect punishment to do in terms of behavior? My reading of the relevant literature is that we can at least see 18 different behavioral effects of punishment. 8.
Wow.
8 of them are positive, 10 are negative. And it depends on the situation, types of behavior, types of punishment, type of people involved, organizations involved, what happens. So to give you some examples on the positive side. So which type of punishment, what is the type of mechanisms where it will increase compliance? Well, we already mentioned deterrence. So there's general deterrence, because you see others punished, you think you also comply better. Specific deterrence, because you have been punished, you'll comply better in the future. There is ending impunity. So you set a norm by not punishing, you're actually saying it's okay. It's all on the positive side. Incapacitation. If you commit somebody, if you put somebody in prison, they can't commit the crime again outside. Those are all on the positive side. If you revoke a license of a company, or you shut it down, or in China, they sometimes blow up companies, polluting companies. I mean, they can't do it again. On the negative side, there's a lot of things happening. For instance, and this goes to the UK case. So everybody now hears that this guy has gone out, this advisor to Boris Johnson, and violated lockdown. So there's several things you can say that happened there. One is, yes, if he's punished now, that ends impunity. If he's not punished, people see impunity. If he's punished, maybe people get deterred because they think, oh, wow, I'm afraid because he's punished. Let's go to the negative side now. You see him doing that, you might think, oh, so that's what people do. So it might normalize a violation. Other things that can happen with punishment. You can also, if you have been complying without punishment and you introduce a punishment, it might mean that you see, oh, what I was doing for just because of myself, now it gets punished. Oh, maybe I shouldn't have been doing that. So you might undermine intrinsic motivation. You can get catch and mouse type of behavior. The harsher the punishment, the more you get evasion. So it might actually mean that people just take better care not to get caught. So there's all these different things that can happen. It really depends on the case, what actually will happen. So I think that's an important role when we're talking about behavioral risk, is to think about, okay, what can we expect punishment to do? There's two things to really watch. The first is the certainty of punishment is more of a driver than the severity. So you need a basic threshold level of certainty before severity works. So that means you need to police more. And as you already mentioned, some of this behavior is very private. We're asking people inside their own homes, but also inside all these businesses to do all kinds of things that they normally don't do. The second thing is that people need to have the perception that they will get caught and punished. And that means that it's not just about the punishment, because very often people don't have a good idea of what the actual punishment is. People overestimate and underestimate the chances of being caught or punished. So that means that law enforcement needs to communicate. So there's a lot of nitty-gritty there that I don't see in the simplistic messages that we've seen so far. So for instance, in the UK, with the lockdown easing, one of the only things they did to accommodate worries about that it would be harder now is to raise the fines. Simply raising fines with a couple of £100 or £50, I forgot how much it was. That's not really leveraging out of punishment. What you need to do is to think smart and behaviorally. Okay, if we're going to use punishment, how do we do it in a way that doesn't undermine intrinsic motivation? And how do we do it in a way that people actually buy it?
Right. It's interesting because I live in the UK. I don't know what the fine is either. Not that I'm intending to get caught by it, but but it hasn't resonated with me in any way, shape, or form. I know that the number's gone up, but
yes, and there's another danger. So once it becomes unreasonable, and there's a lot of research on this, unreasonable law enforcement can undermine people's obligation to obey the rules generally. So if you look at studies about policing in the US and racial discrimination, etc., for certain groups, the perception of the police is so negative that they have a lower view of the legal system as a whole and feel less bound by it. Well, that's the thing you really want to prevent. If there's one thing we have going for us in open societies, it's that people generally think, because of the democratic system and the rule of law, that whatever the government in the end does, even if we don't agree, we should comply. It's just rules of the game. Once that is eroded, then all you have left is a system of repression. And I'm not saying that doesn't work. I mean, China clearly, and we haven't done the studies yet, but I'm pretty sure that in China, both the social and the governmental enforcement was very, very strong. Of course, there was also a combination of intrinsic motivation with people not wanting to become sick and other things, but the type of surveillance they have in China is just much stronger. We don't seem to be ready or willing to go there. And if we don't want to go there, we have to be careful that we don't lose the general support that we have for the policies and the legal system.
And do you think any thought has been given to this idea? Because it seems to me that governments were very reactive, and particularly where I am in the UK and the US, it's kind of like, well, we'll delay. And even though we can see what's going on elsewhere, the measures will, whether it's containment measures or whether it's laws or whether it's communications, all of that stuff happened very late. And so what I find really interesting is this idea that you've started down a route that has unleashed certain behaviors. And therefore, your ability to deploy certain techniques later on, it's almost like a game of chess, right? Where you sort of they're not thinking several moves ahead. They're just thinking, possibly quite understandably, with the here and now, in a very short term, how do we get people right now to do what we want?
Yes.
But of course, that restricts your later move. So if you're the chess grandmaster, you're thinking 20 moves ahead.
Yep.
Doesn't seem to be any of that. And so what the picture you seem to be painting is one that says they have potentially boxed themselves in quite heftily without thinking it through because of the speed with which these things were evolved and the short-term thinking that went into it. Is that a fair depiction?
I think it's fair as a descriptive. I'm not sure I would say I would judge them negatively on that because it's been very hard. I mean, of course, for those of us who follow China carefully, and I'm one of them, early January, I already told my graduate students, look, I'm not sure you can do your interviews in September. They're like, what are you talking about? I said, well, if this is a little bit like SARS, but if we're not lucky, like we were with SARS in 2003, where it suddenly died, we're all going to be facing this. So I think people could have looked ahead. I think it's very human not to think you have a risk until you have it. Also, I think if they had moved to lockdowns 2 weeks earlier, 3 weeks, or a month earlier, even a week, it wouldn't have worked. They wouldn't have been able to get the people to do it. So I think we all have 20/20 hindsight. I mean, my hindsight is if we'd please lock down fully so that we'd actually in several jurisdictions at the same time had had killed the disease. I mean, China sort of did that. I mean, didn't fully succeed. But of course, we could have never gotten people to support that because even now, I mean, people would say, well, there's still going to be a vaccine. So I think hindsight is just that. It's perfect. I do agree with you that now that we're out of the first crisis, now that we've bought us some time, I think now is the time where we, A, know this is serious and it's a problem for all of us, not just health, also economy, society. B, what are the actual steps? What is the scenarios going forward? And that's what I'm missing now. It feels like we're now in a time where we could be less reactive and more proactive, where we're not sufficiently. Sure, everybody's saying that we should track and trace. Fine, you want to build that capacity. But I think the big question is, okay, how are we going to get ready for a second wave? What does it need? I mean, what intervention could we really use to get rid of it, or to how do we get people to comply at that time? And each of the steps that we're now taking, also in terms of the expectations that we're developing in society, should play a role there. So I think, for instance, when I now hear some officials saying we're not sure we're going to get a vaccine in a year, I think that's probably a good signal to send. It's never been a realistic expectation as far as I understand. I mean, most vaccines have taken a decade to develop. Same for, yes, there's going to be a second wave. I think people should know that. So I think it's with those things where you can maybe as a chess player buy yourself time to prepare well for the next steps. So another step I think that they could now take is say, okay, a second lockdown, what does it look like? How do you prepare for a lockdown? Now that we have some time to prepare, we can actually tell people, here you have a couple of weeks. I mean, last time we had a lockdown here in the Netherlands, at 5:30, they said that all restaurants and bars had to be closed by 6. I biked around town, they were all closed at 6, which is a miracle, but it's not a good way of really getting the best behavioral change that we want to achieve, I think, in this situation.
I'm intrigued as well by you referenced Dominic Cummings, who's Boris Johnson's advisor, who, as we record this, is causing quite a lot of scandal by what I think everybody who is sort of looking at reasonably terms if not a legal breach of the rules, it was certainly a spiritual breach of them. It sets a bad example. And we've had lots of sort of examples of you can look at the US as well, where you've sort of had behavioural transmission of sort of norms, where it's either authority figures behaving in a certain way. So you might have the rules in place look sensible, but the behaviour patterns we see from individuals and from influencers is significant. How do you see the power of that? And is that as derailing as it seems to be feeling in the UK at the moment, where everybody's saying this is awful because it's on a visceral level, it's irritating people because they've been compliant and he's perceived not to have been. But more broadly, does it send signals? How important do you think that is in the sort of scheme of influencing decision making?
So there's several things I'm thinking of this. So first of all is research about compliance managers in the chemical industry in the US. And a study done by Robert Kagan, Neil Gunningham, and Thornton that looked at how do managers view other companies getting punished for breaking the rules. And they found it reassures them. I've been complying at tremendous costs, and now that I see others getting caught and punished, it reassures me that I haven't been crazy.
Right.
I think if in this case there's no punishment, people are not reassured. If there is punishment, they may be reassured. So that's one element. There's the other element, which is social norms. The more attention you give to this case, the more people, even though they might be outraged by it, they also get the message this is happening. They get it at a time where, anecdotally in the Netherlands, and I haven't seen it for the UK, but I've seen it also in the US, they see more and more people going out and about and getting closer to each other and doing things that weren't allowed. So I think the social norms are really shifting. early April, we saw that social norms only played a role significantly in the US, which to me was surprising. I mean, social norms are very strong drivers of behavior. But this early April, we didn't see it very much influencing. I'm pretty sure if we had data now, we'd probably see social norms playing a more important role. So I think that's an interesting part a case like that can play. It can strengthen people's views, what they see all around them. A third part of it is it does lead to a debate about what's right and wrong, sort of the expressive function of law, which I think is important with a kind of exemplary case like this. I mean, people might, because of this, come to commit again to the rules because they can express that this is really wrong. But for other people, it might be, look, he did it. I also wanted to do that. And actually, so now you see it's right. So it can have different effects.
So it's pretty significant then. And I was thinking about when you were talking about the US, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is we talk about the US like it's a homogenized single block.
Yes.
And of course, culturally, there are huge differences. You've got the states have a lot of authorities themselves. So you have different lockdown provisions in different states, different messages from different leaders. Yep. And so it's, the Netherlands and the UK, to the extent the UK is holding together, at least a more homogenized blocks and smaller units. Whereas in the US, your media there could easily find an example of people doing outrageous things either way. Yes, no, you're right. I mean, the US is, and I've lived there for 5 years. It's many different countries. It's a developing country and a highly rich developed country. And even with within small parts of the US, I lived in Orange County, which is much smaller than the Netherlands. Just the amount of variation you find there. I mean, Orange County has been one of the places where people flock to the beach, also in protest, direct violation of the rules at the end that were still in place. And this is in democratic California, which is very progressive. But there were very conservative forces that were very much against the rules. And some of the beach communities, if you look at electoral maps of the 2016 election, you can really clearly see that there's a small sliver of conservatives living right on the beach. You go a little bit inland, then you get all these Democrats in suburbs and urban areas. And you go a bit more inland, and suddenly it's conservative again. And you see very different values and norms there. And I think what matters there, once you're dealing with morals, I actually today was writing about this. I'm doing a popular science book about how law shapes our behavior. I was writing a chapter on morals and how morals shape our behavior. And you clearly see that conservatives in the US, they don't care about climate change. For them, it's not a human, it's not a problem that humans cause. It's not something that requires action, and the actions taken are very negative, and they don't even help the environment. Yet researchers found, when they did a study, they found that most appeals to do something about the environment, and I think this might also relate to the COVID stuff, the moral appeals we have are all based on care, on having sufficient care for the weak things in environment. So we see trees that are felled, we see a coral reef that's bleached, and the psychologists, they find that conservatives have a very different moral package. They do care about care and equality, but they also care, for instance, about purity, loyalty, and authority, which progressives don't care about. So they did an experiment. They gave a group of Americans different types of environmental messages. Ones were traditional, kind of care-based. The others were based on purity. So very much based on showing a clear blue sky, and that the sky then gets disgusted gets polluted with clouds of a smokestack, or they show lungs after pollution. And they found that once they used those messages, the conservatives were as likely to support climate change policies as progressives. So I think that also applies to this. I think a lot of what we're doing in terms of moral appeals is very traditional, based on, well, we should help the NHS, we should care for the elderly. And maybe if we'd look deeper into the social science here, we'd find other ways to reach people that maybe are harder to reach, as we've done now. That's really interesting. And particularly when you point to political differences equals cultural differences. And the US being a really good example of sort of, if I take the extremities of someone that believes in, anti-abortion, pro-guns, as opposed to somebody, the opposite end of the spectrum,
Yep.
You're right. There's a moral piece that underpins it, but it's not just a political standpoint, and that bleeds through into a whole load of other. So that's a fascinating angle that
Yes.
I guess is quite challenging in some respects in our one size fits all communications.
Yes. Well,
Can get lost in. You can end up missing the target audience.
yes. So for me, a lot of things in compliance are about communication, and I'm trying to team up increasingly with communication scientists. So it is about communication. How do you communicate to multiple audiences at the same time? And what I liked in seeing the Dutch press conferences was it seemed that our prime minister had somebody whispering in his ear, a social scientist. He was really, getting to all the right notes. So he would open every conference saying, well, I want to thank everybody for doing such a great job. Most people, most of the time, are just complying with the rules. And I was like, yes, Cialdini.
Right, yeah.
Is the most famous, social psychologist who writes about social norms. Somebody had told him about this. He wasn't focused on rule breaking. He had these different types of messages. And I think in the US, obviously, it's harder than in the Netherlands. But if in this experiment I discussed, if you can get these two divergent groups to support this, there is one really big but. And this is not from psychology, but from sociology. So one study in the US looked at whether people in Louisiana it asked, why do people in Louisiana vote for the Tea Party at the time? So 2015, 14, even though they're completely against regulation of environmental issues. And these people lived in squalid pollution. They were aware that they were sick because of pollution. They were aware that they'd lost income. And the end conclusion that the book made, it's called Strangers in Their Own Land, was that people saw the problem, but there was one thing they hated more than the problem, which was the solution, which was more government. And they've been led to believe that the government was the worst thing in the world. And I think that also applies to this. Obviously, this is a socialist nightmare for people who fear their freedom. Under U.S. discourse. If this had been done under a democratic president, there would have been a civil war type situation. We've been lucky in a sense that Trump was there because he could kind of give it some credence. And I'm saying that with the greatest hesitance, because obviously the Trump administration has not responded ideally. But I think that early April, when they were still surrounding this, we didn't find political orientation mattered in the US, which is surprising. We had a question on conservatives versus progressives. Mid-March till the 23rd of March, if I look at other people's research, it mattered a lot. I'm pretty sure it matters again now. At the time, it didn't play a role.
Which is really surprising.
Very surprising. But again, I think it's because of early April. I think early April was a very special time, even in the US.
And as you look at that time period, I hesitate to use the word unprecedented,
yes.
Right? Because I would say there's been an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, which
yes.
is ridiculous amounts.
Yes.
But are there any parallels that you have managed to find as you sort of thought about this that we can at least pin it on something, or is this really a very, very different situation because of the dynamics of it?
No, I wrote a piece in The Hill where I started with that this, in my eyes, has been the biggest, largest scale human behavioral change in terms of how many humans were involved, that it was directed by governments, that it was at extreme costs, and that it was, at least in terms of the behavioral change, massive. If you look at other attempts at this, prohibition, alcohol in the US, massive failure. If you look at the war on drugs, massive failure. And of course, what we're talking about here is also all behavior. You're asking people to do something completely fundamentally different. And then if you add to that we don't find fear of disease to be the major factor, it makes it even more unique. And of course, it's just a couple of surveys we did, and I think in 2 or 3 years once we add all the data together. And I'm happy that a lot of colleagues are studying the same questions with different methods, with different types of questions or observations or other things. We'll be really able to get to the answer. But to me, it seems yes, in modern times, I don't know of a single event that changed behavior across the globe this rapidly at this cost.
Do you think it plays into people's perceptions of what government should be doing and the sort of view? Does this represent, I guess, sort of bigger threat to our democracy and government's ability to influence, either because governments will grab powers that they can push, and people's propensity to accept that might be increased, or because people might rebel against it and therefore not be compliant, in inverted commas, in a way that they might have been under normal circumstances?
To me, the biggest worry in terms of the politics of this is whatever happens, in the end, people are going to be angry. So, for instance, Israel, I heard from colleagues, they had the same rules, they had a bit stronger enforcement. You weren't allowed to go more than 100 meters from your home to exercise. I had a friend who was stopped by police at 300 meters. And he was able to talk himself out of a fine, but a lot of people got fined within 500 meters of their house. So people now have been asking, well, I think a couple of hundred people died. Why did we do all this? So whatever happens, I think in the end, it'll seem that the amount of disease and death maybe wasn't worth it. So that's one way to look at it. And the economic cost is already also very, very large. At a scale that seems to be like the Great Depression. And we're not even at the end of this. There's going to be a second wave. We're going to be longer into this than we think. The other end of it is as well, if somehow governments don't respond well for the next time, they're going to be responsible for the death. So I think what happens is either it undermines the trust of people in government, and or it leads that government is going to shift blame. And that's where I have a worry that I also see in the media now more and more, who are going to shift blame on the scientists. And of course, scientists are all about not being sure. That's our job. Our job is to say, we see a significant relationship between A and B. That doesn't mean that A causes B. It means that there's a likelihood that A played a role in variation of B. Of course, in media, in a media event or in a newspaper or as advice to government, you can't say that. You just have to say it's going to be A or it's going to be B. And I think that makes it hard for scientists to give good advice. It also makes it very easy to blame scientists for whatever decision that politics took, even though the politics is responsible. It's not the science. And I think also the trust in science may be undermined because citizens see scientists now in open debate about things that they really, really care about, where normally they don't. And scientists are always in debate, but now that you kind of pull the veil back, you suddenly see a tremendous amount of insecurity, which is inherent in science, but not in the popular view of science. It's sort of, they're very wise, they know.
Right, and it's not helped by movies. If I think of like Jurassic Park, or the character that Jeff Goldblum always seems to play in things, right, which is the smart guy who can see what's going on, and if only everybody would listen to him, we'd be fine. Of course, they don't, and by the end of the movie, they sort of do. And I think it's really interesting when you get the phrase, and we've heard this a lot in the UK, we are following the science.
Yes.
Without identifying which aspect of what do you mean by that?
Yes,
and of course, I think there's a really interesting thing that you see in the media, which is this desire to balance.
Yes.
So we will have representative A, world-renowned expert in climate change, and then we'll get some guy who's just read something on the internet who's presented as the opposite view to give quote unquote balance.
Yes.
And I think there's something interesting that you're right that science is being pushed into a world of sort of you have to deliver certainty because you're an expert.
But I think,
and what are you spending your time doing if you don't have the answers?
But I think there's also danger in the world that we're both in, which is behavioral science. If I look at the last years at behavioral insight teams, like the UK team, at sort of Nudge, the promise has been, look, if you listen to us, you can achieve things you could never achieve before. If we're 100% honest, we often, don't really know what the solution is from a scientific point of view. If we do know from an experiment, we don't know if that works in every situation, if it works for a long term, and what the negative effects are going to be in the longer term. And I think because as behavioral science and social science has pushed itself more in this role, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be, it just has to be there in the right way, where it can sort of say, look, I'm going to help ask the right questions, show you what options there are, but I'm not going to sell you my options or become a brand selling option A always. Because I think there's a danger there that we're overclaiming, and also that it hurts our science as well, because we've always, in the public, shown option A to work. Then our next study, if it doesn't work, in science, becomes harder. So I think I see that playing out now with the virologist and the epidemiologist. I'm thinking, okay, what if everybody listened to the behavioral scientists? Which, I mean, I'm unhappy that they don't, but I'm not sure I would be happy if they did.
Right.
I mean, there's a doubt I have there. So I have the same sort of mission you have, which is to bring the science to a broader audience. But I do want the science to be there in a nuanced way. So for instance, in the popular science book we're writing, I am showing also the 1 or 2 or 3 studies that show a different story. So that's sort of like the members of the studio that you just mentioned. But I do think it's important because science is never in full agreement. And also I see a lot of the science that gets into the newspaper is single studies that are really cool. It's not the 500 studies. For instance, if you look at punishment again, the one field I've seen the strongest work is about rehabilitation. There's hundreds of studies with randomized trials, with experimental measurements that show that rehabilitation can really work against a whole base of crimes, and that punishment works mostly negative. Is that sexy? No. Is it surprising? Maybe a little, because it has a bad rep. But that's not really the cool stuff that makes it into the newspaper. I mean, a meta-analysis of 500 studies showing that it has an effect is way less cool than one study showing that a particular form of nudge had a cool effect somewhere. I think that's something in the world that we live in that we have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my answer to that in what I do is I play in spaces where no consideration is given to this whatsoever. Yes. And so a little bit of being careful of kind of Dunning-Kruger end of the spectrum, but a little bit of thinking about it can take you quite a long way. But I'm not going to sit there and tell you what the optimal solution is. But if I can get your compliance levels from 10% to 60%,
yes,
with marginal, that's great. I'm not going to promise you 100%.
No.
And I'm sure as hell not going to tell you whether it's going to be 50 or 70,
yes,
but I'm sure we can improve. But I think you make an absolute point, which is it's often presented as a silver bullet.
Yes.
And I think one of the interesting things we've also seen is there has been this perception in some jurisdictions that the behavioral science has been leading.
Yes.
So in other words, we start with and the cynics would say, let's start with manipulating people in the right way, exactly, and then we'll let everything else backfill it. To my mind, it's the other way around. It's kind of like, what outcome are you trying to achieve?
Yes.
And how can we bring this toolkit alongside other stuff?
Yes.
To maybe think about it, and we should run it through that lens to test stuff,
yes,
rather than saying this leads. Because I think you know, as you say, you very quickly get into there was a whole issue in the UK at the beginning about behavioural fatigue.
Yes,
was it a thing? Yes. Wasn't it a thing?
Yes,
and that kind of overtook the message,
yep,
more than actually what we wanted people to do. There are these people advertisers are trying to manipulate us.
Yes, no, and look, if once you get it wrong as a scientist, it'll backfire so hard because people want to see it fail.
Right.
And I think that's the sort of climate we're in. So that's why I mentioned in terms of risks, yes, there's political risks. I mean, of course, there's also opportunities coming out of a crisis for better politics. Yeah, I saw this op-ed this morning in the New York Times kind of saying, look, we all don't know the future, so we don't know what the effects will be exactly. But I think for us in behavioral science, there's an opportunity to showcase things. But we have to be careful. If we overclaim, if we sort of say more than we can, it can really bite us back and set us back as well.
Final question is: you're obviously still working through various territories. What's the sort of next game plan? Are you going to rerun the exercise? Are you going to look at things slightly differently? Where do you go from here?
So the biggest thing we're doing now is we're continuing surveys in the US and the Netherlands all over the summer. So we're actually tracking change. Not just in the behavior, but also in the mechanisms that shape it. So I think that's going to be the most important thing that we're doing. The other thing I've done is I teamed up with people in the Netherlands who've been using CCTV camera footage. So we actually have objective measures of behavior that we can link to our surveys. And then we're working with communication scientists that are looking in social media postings. So we can kind of take the temperature in social media. What are people discussing? We can frame that. We can analyze that. Are they seeing more social norms, more violations? Are they starting to disagree with the policy? Then we can look at what do we see on the street? Are people still keeping a distance? And then we can look at what are they saying on our surveys. So we're trying to combine that to get a much richer picture. The other big thing is I'm looking at China. If you're asking how can we look at the future, I think China is about a month and a half ahead of us, 2 months ahead of us. Of course, it's a different system, different rules, everything different. They've also had a different history with disease. But what I'm really interested in is first of all, how's compliance working out now there? Second, what other tools are they using? So instead, they have this whole QR code system where you can't get into a train or to bars. For me, any of those systems, I look at okay, how can humans violate the system? So I'm trying to...
I love that.
Well, it's sort of, I mean, in the media here, these apps are kind of presented as, well, if we have that, it'll rob us of our freedom, but at least it's going to be automated, it'll work perfect. To me, those systems are still human systems. So for instance, I have a restaurant, I have a QR code system set up, but people show up without the right QR code. Am I going to let them in? Still a human decision. There's no gate that automatically opens for these people or not. Right? So I think looking at that deeper is going to be interesting also for debates here about similar systems. That's sort of where we're going. At some point in a couple of months, what I really hope to do is look at all the research together, not just ours, but others, and kind of look back historically. What did we go through in terms of compliance? Which of the theories that we normally have that predict compliance were actually at play here? What do we see in terms of what are really the big lessons that I can't get to right now yet in terms of this massive behavioral change for other fields? To me, it's too early to do that. I just want to chew on it later and longer when I think most people have already left the field, because I think a lot of people are in it now and getting, maybe COVID compliance tired. But at some point, I want to do a more slower kind of re-chewing of the data and to think more deeply about what we actually witness. Because it's hard to do that in real time.
Right. And on the other hand, as you rightly pointed out, you get windows where those windows may not exist again. So you need to grab the opportunity to get the data and gather. Yeah. So there's an interesting kind of combination of sort of you want the bigger, longer term picture, but also you don't want to miss that opportunity to tap in in the moment that might be useful for later on in a way that you can't necessarily get hold of at a later date. Wow.
Yes.
That was amazing. Look, when the book is out, I would love to have you back on to talk about that, because I know based on this conversation, but two, the things I've seen of yours before, that it's going to be an absolutely fascinating read and the kind of thing that my listeners should definitely be aware of. And look, thank you so much for spending the time and for the work that you're doing, because I think it's fascinating. One of the things I think that just the average people, we're thinking, are we going mad? And how are we all feeling about these things? And one of the questions you're helping to answer is sort of, is it okay to feel this way? And how are other people responding? And just almost acknowledging that there are some unknowns around that, I think is very healthy in a world where people cleave to certainty. Pointing out that the world is a bit uncertain is strangely reassuring.
Right.
So thank you so much for that. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Benjamin for appearing on the show and to you for listening. More details of his research and articles can be found in the show notes. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. As ever, if you have a chance to leave a review on that site, that's extremely helpful because it increases the profile of the show and allows me to continue to attract the kind of high quality guests I've managed so far. It also allows other people to find the show, so it's a nice pro-social thing to do. If you're not subscribed to the Human Risk newsletter, that comes out every fortnight and looks at human risk topics in the news, then you can find details of that again in the show notes or at human-risk.com. And if you're really keen on human risk, do follow my @HumanRiskBlog Twitter account, where I post on a almost hourly, well probably a few times a daily basis. My thanks again to you for listening. I'm going to bring out more of these episodes very soon, so stay tuned on this channel. And above all, please remember, stay safe and look after yourselves. I'll see you very soon.